when we don't defend and we don't attack and we don't avoid, and instead we self-disclose, we go towards the person instead of away from them. And we make that opportunity to connect and extend ourselves to them so we can actually start bidding for connection. How do we build better connections with the people who are significant to us in our lives? How we do that is by discovering more about the basics of human emotions. And in order to do that, we have to understand three things. We have to understand our brain psychology and how we connect. We have to understand our emotional heritage. And the third thing, we have to understand and sharpen our communication skills. Because as living beings, we have the capacity to grow and develop continuously. And if we can practice insight and build those skills, we can basically create better emotional awareness and have better relationships. Hey mama, welcome to episode 68 of the systems.Last podcast. Today on the podcast, we are going to have a conversation about investing in relationships, and it's going to be a two-part conversation, so the next week is going to be a continuation of that conversation. Today we are going to learn and continue with a conversation about bidding for relationships. We're going to learn what are some things, we're going to learn 6 things that actually make it difficult for us to bid and bust our bids, basically. We're going to talk about how to build better connections with the significant people in our lives. So our friendships, our marriages, our dating relationships, our relationship with our children, how we can build better connection. We'll also talk about a concept of the emotional command systems. And in addition to that, we'll talk about those 7 systems. There are 7 systems. And then we'll talk, last but not least, on how to evaluate our emotional command systems. So this is basically the second building block of our Strengthening Relationships series. And this one is going to be how to start investing, how to start practicing awareness and to start investing. Hey mama, you deserve a life free of overwhelm and burnout. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. I'm your host, life and mindset coach, Shiro Bergbauer. I'm also a wife, mom, and CRNA. This is the podcast for high-achieving mamas in medicine like you and I. Together, we'll learn how to navigate the ups and downs of working motherhood. If you're looking to thrive in your relationships and overcome overwhelm in your motherhood, marriage, and medicine, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. So before we begin, I wanted to share the Cambridge Dictionary definition of investment. And the reason I wanted to share it is because, again, a lot of the times when we think about investment, we do think about money because that's kind of primarily how it's introduced to us. But I wanted to go through that definition so that we had a different kind of understanding of that. So investment is a noun, and it is described as the act of putting money, effort, time, etc., into something to make a profit or get an advantage, or the money, effort, time, etc. used to do this. So if you think about investing in time, investing in ourselves, investing in the relationships, we are basically putting effort into something to achieve a result. And that is the second definition, which is the act of putting money or effort into something to make a profit or achieve a result. I just think like the goal here is to achieve a result. And so when we think about the result that we want in relationships, it's to communicate better, to have better connections, to engage with each other from a place of understanding each other and loving each other. And so whatever relationship you are trying to invest in, I think all of this builds on that. And In case you haven't listened to episode 67, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to that episode because that was the basically building block of the conversation that we're continuing to have. And in that conversation, we talked about what our bids for connection are and how are they received. So in the second part, it's going to be a 2-episode series. We're going to start talking about now how do we, first of all, identify when we are not investing in our bids. And then we're going to begin to understand our brain's emotional connections. Next week, we are going to talk about how to examine our emotional heritage, how to sharpen our inner emotional communication, and then how to find shared meaning and apply what we've learned in this series. Again, this is based on John Gottman's work and a series of other books that I've been reading, but primarily John Gottman's book, which I will link in the show notes, called The Relationship Cure, a 5-step guide to strengthening your marriage, family, and friendships. So if you are interested in reading about this work and doing some of the assessments that are available from this work, it will be in the show notes. You can just click onto it and you will get directed to my Amazon store where you can purchase the book. So let's get started. So the first thing when I was thinking about investing in relationships, I happened to be listening to an interview that I was interviewed by my good friend, Maggie Reyes, who is the marriage life coach. And I will link that episode too on the show notes. And Maggie and I had a conversation because I took one of her courses and it really kind of set the foundation too of the work that I was doing in my own marriage, had so many insights. And then what I did notice is because I was doing the work and because I had started to dig deeper, I was connecting with people because they wanted to work on their marriage, and I was getting consults from people who wanted to work on their marriage. And it was very encouraging because it was very like it's life-changing work, but it's also interesting work in that nobody really tells you that this is work that you have to do. In fact, one of my clients said to me, like, how come nobody tells us, like, we should be learning these things before we get married? Like, we're planning weddings, we're, going to get married, and we're just, like, so excited about a wedding. And we're not really understanding, like, how do we connect with our spouses? How do we bid with our spouses? So in that conversation with Maggie, I was actually inadvertently, I had to reflect on my why. And again, the conversation, she didn't tell me what she was going to ask me. And so the conversation was very, free flowing. But as we were speaking, my why really came so boldly and strongly to me. And it was also when I was starting to do the work in Maggie's course. And I will also link Maggie's course on here if you're interested in taking it. I believe it's $97 as of today when I'm publishing in 2022. But yeah, it's a great course if you're a self-study kind of person. So my why was very interesting because I met my husband actually on Mother's Day. We celebrated 13 years since our first date. So we met on May 8th. Oh my gosh, I cannot count. Yes, 13 years. For a second, I was like, wait, I can't count. Yes, 13 years. We met on May 8th, 2009. I was literally about to start grad school. I started grad school on June 30th. I started my anesthesia training on June 30th. Anyway, when we met on Match.com. It's kind of funny now to talk about that because I don't even think it exists anymore. Does it? I don't know. But we met on Match.com. We went on our first date. And it was a very interesting season because, again, I was starting a very difficult program. But as soon as we met, we just wanted to be together every day. We spent so much of our time together. A year in our relationship, my husband was here basically he was working for an Austrian company. So he was here on a management visa working for an Austrian company. And he had to go back to Europe. But actually, during that year, they had offered him the opportunity of staying and filing his paperwork and all that stuff. Long story short, there was some restructuring going on in the business, and my husband had to move back to Austria. So I just remember it was a year into our relationship. We were lying in bed and we were both crying. because it just looked so impossible. He was moving back to Europe for an basically unknown amount of time. I couldn't go back with him. I was 1 year into my 2.5 year training. And so we just like had a conversation and we're like, we are going to make this work. And the reason I share this is because there are times when we forget how much we want to be with the person that we're with in a relationship, and we take each other for granted unknowingly and not out of malice or unkindness, just unknowingly we do that. My husband moved back to Europe. We spent the rest of so this was in 2010, early 2010. We spent the rest of 2010 figuring out how he could come back and like all that stuff. You guys, the first Christmas well, it was our second Christmas together, but our first Christmas had been so magical. We had gone to the East Coast. We had spent so much time just having a grand old time. And that first Christmas apart, he was coming home from England. He was doing a project in London. He was coming home from England, and there was a horrible storm in London. He was supposed to get here like 2 days before Christmas, and he got stuck at the airport. And I know I'm telling a long story, but there's a reason why. He got stuck at the airport, but he finally made it. I think he had to go from like Heathrow to Gatwick and like figure out how to get home. And we were so lucky we were able to spend Christmas together, but it was just like, oh my gosh, it took so much for us to be together. Then he came back to the US literally the month that I graduated grad school, which was December of 2011. So we had been apart almost 2 years, like long distance, all of that, traveling back and forth, me having very limited vacation time. I traveled to London in the middle of my training to be together. It was just wild. Anyway, so he comes back and his new company begins to figure out his logistics of staying in the US. And he has to go do a project in Europe. I want to say he was gone for a year. And the beginning of 2014, he came back and we were like, for sure, like, okay, this is it. He can stay here. And that was a year we got married. Our wedding song was At Last. It's a song by Etta James. And the first verse of the song says, "At last, my love has come along. My lonely days are over, and life is like a song." This song meant so much to me because we had worked so hard to be together and we wanted to be together. And so we settled down, we bought our house, we had our wedding, and then life began, right? And as time goes by, you start to forget those times when you cried to be together and you wanted to be together. And you inadvertently take it for granted that you are together, that you are literally living your dream. And why that was important for me to remember my why is because, again, we have also created this life together. We have a beautiful child together. We have connected our families. There's so many whys. But my deepest why, and I can't speak for my husband because he can tell his why in his own time. He will actually be coming to the podcast soon. My biggest why is it took so much for us to be together that I never want to take that for granted. And when I do, I want to remember that it took so much for us to be together. I share this story because sometimes in relationships and when I coach my clients sometimes, we get so caught up in the day-to-day of our relationships that we really forget the days when we were single and the days when we wanted to be with somebody and the days we first met the person that we now love and how amazing it was and how it felt so good to be connected to them. And we sometimes forget that and we take them for granted. And it's so important for us to notice when we are losing our bids for connecting with them, when we are turning away from their bids, when we are neglecting our own needs in our relationships and neglecting the people that we love. again, it's not purposefully. It's not like you wake up in the morning and you're like, yep, I'm going to neglect my husband today. It happens over time. And if we're not careful, we start to not bid with each other anymore. We start to turn away from each other. So, all this to say, the reason I'm so passionate about coaching on relationships, whether marriage, whether motherhood, whether friendships, is because there is always that why that we sometimes forget. So I want to ask you today to just reflect on the relationship that you want to work on and think about your why. Why did you connect with that person in the first place? How did that feel? How did those first days feel for you? And when sometimes there was a risk of that relationship ending, what was it that kept you going? I always make this disclaimer, though, on this podcast. I am not talking about abusive relationships, neglect and toxic and gaslighting relationships. I'm talking about a relationship where the connection is just losing itself, but you guys know, you both know that you're safe and secure and you can reconnect if you invest in yourselves. So that is the first thing I want to offer. So last week, we talked about bids for connection, and today, what I want to talk about is 6 ways in which we bust our bids and some ways in which you can think about how to not do that. So, the first one is when we are being mindless rather than being mindful. Mindlessness doesn't mean that we're like reckless and not just like caring. It's when we are not in the present moment and minding. And the key to being mindful is to really look for and celebrate the moments in which we connect with another person on a feeling level. And for that to happen, we have to notice an emotional expression as a bid for connection. It could be they smile at us, or they have a facial expression, they raise a brow, or they gesture, or they say something, and that reveals their emotional state. It might reveal that they're happy. Are they sad? Are they angry? Are they afraid? Are they ecstatic? What is it? If we are mindful, then we notice that. If we are mindless, we fail to notice those little ways in which we can connect with that person on a feeling level. The second one is starting on a sour note. That's when a bid begins in such a negative, blaming, or critical way, and so you get just the opposite of what you came for. You drive that person away, and what we think about is like a harsh startup. It's like, the person comes to talk to you, and you have such a harsh startup to the conversation that you literally sabotage any way that they could have bid with you to connect. You basically, in not so many words, you kind of push them away, because imagine walking up to a person and the person is like, hey, do you want to do this and that? And you're like, what's wrong with you? Or you show up and you say, express yourself, and you feel criticized and you feel neglected. That is such a harsh startup. And it's so difficult to recover from that in the immediate moment, right? Because if you show up in that conversation and you basically you criticize, or it's just like harsh from the get-go, it's so hard to recover from that, right? It's like, I think about this like when my daughter says something, and if I don't notice to connect with that, then we lose our ability to connect. Or if my husband comes to say something to me in my office and I'm working really hard and I'm like, oh my God, I'm trying to like get this thing done, please come back later. But if I say it in a way that's a harsh startup, we can make each other so angry that we don't have a meaningful conversation, right? So what John Gottman said is that in his studies of married couples, he found that 96% of the time you can predict the outcome of a 15-minute conversation based on what happens in the first 3 minutes of that interaction. And if the first 3 minutes include a lot of negativity or criticism or blame, the outcome is not going to be very good. So how do we fix a harsh startup? It could be just by starting our bids on a softer note. And if so, I'm going to give you a couple of examples that John Gottman shared in the book. And it could be that, for example, instead of starting a conversation telling your spouse, like, we never have fun together anymore, we don't even do anything adventurous, the tip for a soft start is to begin with something positive. So in the example, he's like, look at this article about a couple who hiked this specific crest trail. It reminds me of how much fun it is to have adventures with you. Maybe we should plan something new. Or it could be starting with an expression of gratitude. So if just like saying like, oh, I'm so, thanks for spending some time with me, and then maybe say, hey, we could plan something more fun together and spend time together. Or it could be starting a conversation with I instead of you. So it could be like, instead of saying like, you should have called me and you made me stay up all night worried about you, you could say, I was so worried about you when you didn't call and it kept me up all night. And so it basically brings the responsibility of the emotion back to you. And the other one that he offers is to avoid stockpiling comments. I like this one. The one he used, the example of stockpiling complaints, is, I didn't want to say anything, but I can't take it anymore. You haven't asked for sex in over 6 months, and I feel like you don't love me anymore. And instead, offer, I like it when you make the first move, but it's been a while. Can we talk about it? So instead of stacking up all the complaining and all the critique, we kind of move the conversation in a direction where we both take responsibility for how we're showing up. But because we are the ones bringing up the conversation, we can share basically how we want. The other one is using harmful criticism instead of helpful complaints. So helpful complaints are basically sharing what we want to have done, but not criticizing the person. So one thing John Gottman says is, complain when you must, but don't criticize. Criticism is judgmental and global, and it can be like, you always do this and you never do this. And I remember when I was going through therapy with my postpartum depression, and we would have sessions with my husband, like, that was one of the things our therapist helped us understand, is like, when you say you never or you always, it's like globalizing something that's actually not true. The other thing is that criticism attacks the other person's character, because it begins with negative labels or calling names, or, just not even sharing what we want to have done. Criticism hurts people's feelings. It causes increased tension, resentment, and defensiveness in relationships. Which reminds me, even though John Gottman offers us to complain when we must, one of the things that I learned from Maggie is to make a decision to not complain and not defend. And the reason why is because defense is the first act of war. And one of the other things that she shared is, the fight that never happens is the one you never started. So when you start defending and you have a war, quote unquote, then the fight starts, right? So if you don't want to have the war, then you don't start defending. Instead, you're like a fact finder and you find solutions instead of coming up with criticism and defense. Number 4 of the bid busters is flooding. What is flooding? I want you to imagine a time where you were basically flooded with intense emotion. And what that means is, like, you feel so stressed that you become physically and emotionally overwhelmed. So it could be a conversation that just took you into your sympathetic nervous system and you just felt like you couldn't recover from it. So what is the best thing to do when you feel flooded? If you're the one flooded and not the one flooding, one of the things to do is to take a break from the conversation and to do something you find soothing for at least 20 minutes. Now, it could be just asking, hey, like, I take this feedback. I would like some time to process this. I'm going to take 20 minutes away and I'll be back. And letting the other person know that you will return to the conversation. You just need to, like, call in your parasympathetic nervous system in for a little bit. So The other thing is, how can you take steps from preventing flooding in the first place? So, one way is to listen for moments and ask yourself times when you were flooded. And that gives you insights about the things that maybe trigger you. And then you can maybe understand how to avoid such triggers. Now, remember, when you are in conflict with someone and you just feel flooded with fear or anger, your prefrontal cortex literally stops functioning and your best intentions can go out the window. But you can also come up with a word with each other. And this is something that coaches do, like sports coaches do with their athletes. They come up with a word. So when the athlete feels flooded, they can just say the word and everybody knows what's happening and people take a pause. One of the ways my husband and I do this when we are starting to feel like we're getting flooded is we call a timeout. And so we'll say timeout, and one of us will say, let's come back in 10 minutes and have this conversation. And usually it'll be like, I'll go to my room or my husband will go to his office and we just kind of pause, take a break. Number 5 is practicing a crabby habit of mind. That is one way we bust bids. Now, when you have a crabby habit of mind, you're always scanning the environment for things that are imperfect and everybody is at fault and you're just always looking for something's going wrong. The way to reverse this is to start scanning your environment for things and people to appreciate rather than to criticize. I have done podcasts on the power of gratitude, and I share this on this podcast very often. But when we pay attention to what's working, then we notice that a lot of things are working. When we pay attention to things to criticize, everything is wrong. The sky is falling. So I just want to offer you, if you find yourself being in a crabby habit of mind constantly with your partner or your kids or your friends, find things to be grateful for. There is always something that's working. Even in the midst of emotional intensity, there is always things that are working. Number 6 is avoiding the conversation that you need to have. So according to psychologist Dan Weil, many arguments come from issues that people need to discuss, but they don't discuss them. And what happens is when you avoid having conversations because you are conflict averse, you actually create more conflict. Because when that conversation happens, it's a big conflict, hostility, defensiveness, and withdrawal happens, and now you actually do have a serious problem in your hands. So one of the things that Dan Weil offers is if you're in a relationship where there seems to be just an inordinate amount of conflict, take a look at the things that you're not talking about in that relationship. Because maybe somebody in that relationship is making repeated bids for connection around a particular matter, but those bids are being ignored or dismissed. And what Dan Wiles offers us is that when we have interpersonal conflict, we typically have 3 choices. The first choice is to attack and defend, and that is going back to defense is the first act of war, right? If we are attacked or we attack and we defend, then war happens. The second one is avoidance or denial. What happens here is that the person brings up the conflict and then we try to ignore or minimize our negative feelings about the problem. So if we're having a thought about the conflict and we feel the emotion of sadness, we're like, oh, it's not that serious. Don't worry about it. It's not that. And that is just as bad as getting into the conflict and defending. The third choice is self-disclosure and connection. And in doing that, we can discuss how we feel about the problem and work on common understanding. And we may not even come to the perfect compromise or solution, but we establish an emotional connection. Self-disclosure is when we focus on our feelings in that moment, then we can use the I sentences to express how we feel without giving the other person responsibility to make us feel better. So it can look like saying, I feel so angry, I want to yell at you. instead of just yelling at the person, right? Or I feel so upset, I want to leave. But you actually don't have to leave the room or the environment. You're just letting them know how you're feeling in that moment. Now, it doesn't mean that all the problems will go away when we self-disclose, but it gives us an opportunity for us to make an important connection with that person. And instead of attacking and withdrawing, we're extending ourselves and making a bid for understanding. So I just want you to think about that. Like when we don't defend and we don't attack and we don't avoid, and instead we self-disclose, we go towards the person instead of away from them. And we make that opportunity to connect and extend ourselves to them so we can actually start bidding for connection. The second thing we're going to talk about is how do we build better connections with the people who are significant to us in our lives? How we do that is by discovering more about the basics of human emotions. And in order to do that, we have to understand three things. We have to understand our brain psychology and how we connect. The second thing, we have to understand our emotional heritage. And the third thing is we have to understand and sharpen our communication skills. Because as living beings, we have the capacity to grow and develop continuously. And if we can practice insight and build those skills, we can basically create better emotional awareness and have better relationships. So now we're going to dive into the emotional command systems. And the emotional command systems are 7 systems that were first described by a neuroscientist named Jack Panksepp, who was a researcher at Bowling Green State University. And in the emotional command systems, what we understand is that each of them coordinates the emotional, behavioral, and physical responses that we need for certain functions related to survival, such as rest, procreation, self-defense, etc. Now, the theory is that we are all different in how we like to have these systems stimulated. And the best way to understand ourselves is to identify our optimal level of stimulation so that we can have a better understanding of our emotional well-being. So the first thing is to see, first of all, what roles are we most comfortable in, and then what roles are we most likely to succeed in. And the second thing is that understanding this can help us understand how our comfort levels differ from others, which is a very important thing when we're bidding for connection. It's significantly important because then we know that everybody is not like us. So what are these emotional command systems? So if you think about your nervous system as a railroad and your emotions as its trains, the emotional command systems are the tracks on which our emotions run, right? So they can just move your feelings in various directions, and depending on what you want to perform, what service you need to perform, for example, do you want to explore your surroundings? Do you want to seek connection? Do you want to seek intimacy? Do you want to make friends? Whatever the track is where the train will go. But the reality is that these command systems are nerve-based circuits that coordinate the electrochemical signals in the brain. Here's the science part of it. Scientists have used experimental methods to prove the existence of at least 7 separate systems. And these are pathways that transmit messages from one nerve cell to the next until various body parts get the information they need to carry out the services that we desire to carry out. So John Gottman and his team came up with 7 names for these systems so that we could understand and kind of maybe contextualize them based on the names, like what they do. So the 7 systems are the commander-in-chief, the explorer, the sensualist, the energy czar, the jester, the sentry, and the nest builder. Now, what do these systems do? The commander-in-chief is the system in everybody's brain that coordinates the functions that are related to dominance, control, and power. So just think about it, it's the leader of your army. The explorer is the responsible part of your command system that searches, learns, and satisfies your curiosity. So it organizes the ability for us to learn new things, to explore new environments, to tap into our creativity. The centralist coordinates functions related to sexual gratification and reproduction. So this is the system that is necessary for us to be intimate with other people. The energy SAR makes sure that the body gets the rest and the care that it needs to stay healthy. If you remember my boundaries episode, I talked about like the amount of rest we're supposed to take, I believe is 47%. And if we don't take it, it will take us. That is the job of the energy SAR, to make sure that we take the 47%. The jester coordinates functions that are much appreciated but often undervalued, which are play, recreation, and diversion. I can't remember the exact episode, but I will find it and link it in the show notes, where I talk about the laughter, dance, and song, and that is what the jester coordinates. And it's when we were talking about the wholehearted living guideposts. The sentry helps to coordinate functions in the body and the mind that are related to worry, fear, vigilance, and defense. So this is what helps us to regulate our fear by staying away from danger. The nest builder is the system that calls to mind all the nurturing, affiliating, and bonding behaviors and feelings that are typically activated in a solid parent-child relationship. So this part of us coordinates affiliation, bonding, and attachment. And so going back to talking about attachment, and I linked in the last show notes the book Attached, we can understand our nest builder system by seeing how we attach to our parents of origin, our families of origin, and how we attach to the people in our lives. So these command systems often act together. They can be we can be pre-wired for them genetically or based on our lived experience. And the other thing to notice is that they can also be modified through single experiences. So, and that's kind of rare according to the Gottmans and their research. So like an extreme example is if you survive a extremely frightening, life-threatening event and develop PTSD, in those instances, the sentry will basically be like very, very strong, and you may have strong fear responses throughout your body. And so just notice that, is it single event or is it actually the way we are pre-wired? I don't know if this is in the research. I think also it's like the way what we see growing up, the genetic component of it. It's also the environment we grow up in kind of may sometimes pre-wire us to be predisposed to favoring one command system over the other. So the last thing I want to talk about is why should we evaluate our emotional command systems? And I will link the evaluations for each of the systems. I believe you can get them on the Gottman page, but I will link them in the show notes should you want to take the test and see which ones are your strongest ones. It might take you about an hour to do all 7, but it creates important awareness, and which leads me to the first reason why we should evaluate them is so that we can build awareness of our own emotional needs. Number 2 is that it helps us improve our ability to make bids and respond to other people's bids for connection. Right? If we understand our own emotional command systems, for example, if your sentry is the highest, right, it can make you understand why you sometimes are guarded in making bids with other people and are guarded in being vulnerable when the people bid with you. It also helps us to better understand the people you're close to. In fact, one of the things that I have my clients do is we take some of these tests together so that they can understand themselves, and then I offer them maybe to kind of like learn more about the types so that they can understand their partners, their friends, their kids, because it helps them see, oh, maybe this person's jester is more activated than my jester, and that's why they just seem to make fun of every situation when I'm trying to make them serious, for example. Number 4 is that it makes us accept ourselves and others because we start to realize we are complex beings and we are not all the same, and that's okay. The last thing is that it allows us to expect that we will have mismatches. Our emotional command systems may not line up with everybody else's, and that's okay. So we work with them, and we work with understanding that we are perfectly imperfect, and our emotional command systems are different, and that is A-okay. So that is all for today. So next week, we are going to go into part 2 of the investments so we can understand ourselves better and we can go on with the process. So again, today we talked about the 6 ways in which we bust bids. We talked about how we can build better connection with the people who are significant to us. And then we dove into the emotional command systems and had a better general understanding of what they are and how we have them and why we should evaluate them. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you do have time, please take the evaluations and see how you score. And again, don't use the scores against yourself. Everybody's numbers are different, and that's okay. I just want us to all have a better understanding of how do we connect? What is it that gets us to connect the way we do? And that's okay, right? Like we know ourselves now and we can use that information to guide us in creating our bids for connection. I just want to offer you too to really evaluate your why and why you want to invest in your relationships. Whatever the relationships are that you're working on, just take 5 minutes and write down 5 things about each one of them that is a why. And then pick your favorite why and maybe share it with the person. Share it with your spouse or your kid or your friend or your boyfriend. Share with that person and see if you can find shared meaning and why this relationship is important to both of you. Because a lot of the time, we've just kind of forgotten that. We've forgotten our why. And there's nothing wrong with forgetting. We're humans after all. But maybe if we can reconnect and think about the moment where we were the happiest in our relationship, what were we thinking? What were we thinking about that person? Because again, our feelings are not created by circumstances. Our feelings are created by our thoughts. So when I think about the moments of intense joy when my husband came back, I was thinking, I just want to spend all my time with him. And when I find myself not thinking that thought, right, it can be resentment. And then I can work backwards and remind myself, remember how this thought felt? I like this thought much better than he's getting on my nerves thought, right? I like the thought of he's a great guy. He's a great dad. He's a great husband. He loves me. I love him, right? Like, think about the thought you were thinking when you walked down the aisle to meet the love of your life on the other side. What were you thinking about him or her? What were you thinking? And then write that thought down and ask yourself, how can I think this thought every day for the rest of my relationship with this person? And use that as the guiding principle for the rest of your relationship. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll talk next week some more, get deeper in the work. I have just enjoyed really learning more about bidding for connection, coaching my clients on it, seeing their own progress in it. And before I forget, I just thought about something, and I know I just lost my train of thought, but I thought about something that I offered to a client of mine and actually a few of my clients. And that is the idea of just finding something to thank your partner for every day. Just one thing. Try it out. Send me an email and let me know how it's working. I'd love to hear it because I guarantee you, if you can find one thing to thank your partner or your kid or your friend for every day, you find more connecting. So I will talk to you next week. Have a great day. And remember, you are enough and you're worthy of love and belonging. Have a great day. Bye now. I'm Shira Bergbauer, and you've been listening to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. New episodes are out every Monday. These episodes are created by me, Shira Bergbauer, and produced by Cassidy Mitchell. If you enjoyed this show or found it helpful, please rate it and review us on Apple Podcasts. If the concepts I share on this podcast resonate with you, or you're ready to change your relationships and mindset, I can help you. If you'd like in-depth, personalized support, I'd love to invite you to apply for my life and mindset coaching program. Just imagine you and I every week working together as I teach you the tools to up-level your life. To book your free 1-hour consultation call, go to www.stethoscopes2swaddles.com/consultation. You're doing a great job, Mama. Have a great week. Bye now.